you're running out of time, so I want to get into that interesting story about your family. Because when you mentioned that, and I'm like, come on, you got to tell us.
So my grandfather, Christopher Rich, is actually has Scottish descent. So this is on my mother's side, because that's my indigenous side is from my mother's side. So William Sinclair Rich came over back in the late 80s, like 1800s. And he became a Hudson Bay manager. Oh. So he traveled all through Northern Ontario and married Sophie Wynne, and they had several children. And actually, if you Google William Sinclair Rich, you'll find some quite interesting information. So I had always married Indigenous women, and it was an Indigenous family. They just embraced our culture. And then along with that, though, many things were lost because of the Indian Act. You weren't allowed to celebrate. We were Christian. We were really scared away from any kind of traditional celebration because for our safety. It was like, you don't touch that. You don't get involved with that, because you would be punished by the government if you were. Like, there was laws against it. Yeah, it's within the Indian Act. So Jesus. We couldn't even gather over 3 people. Like that was in the Indian Act as well. So you think about this pandemic that we've come through and how we had to live isolated. So generations of people had to live this way, and some things went underground and that sort of thing. But
long before the internet too. And like we can talk to people through Zoom now, so it's not as bad, but holy crap, like back in the day.
So I've always felt that, like, I'm learning now. Like I have my first smudge bowl and all of that. Like, I've started a bit of that and learning about that and reaching out to people and drumming. Like, I have my own drum. It's actually just up here. My brother gave it to me. So learning about that, learning about the jingle dress and that sort of thing. But so back to my family. So my great grandfather, John Rich, who was born and raised in Northern Ontario here, he had Christopher Rich, who's my grandfather. And Chris was a residential school survivor. He had a very traumatic experience, would never really talk about it, talked a bit about it with my aunt, did see children die within school. And what he learned was because they could read and write, there were certain things that allowed you to I guess the term would be enfranchise. So you would totally assimilate, and you were non-Indigenous really in the eyes of the law. So you didn't have a status card holder, that sort of thing. And my mother and her siblings were raised on Agoki Lake, which is northwest of Nakina. And they stayed there in the summertime, and my grandfather was a commercial fisherman. And in the wintertime, they trapped in another area where they lived. And so my mom and her 9 siblings never attended school, residential school. They wouldn't get picked up when the planes would come, but the other families, their relatives that lived on Agoki Lake, they would get picked up every year. So there was this, some of their family was going, their cousins, and some of them weren't, like my mom and her family.
So was it sort of optional for them to go to these schools, or like? No,
you had to, if you were a status Indian, your kids had to go. There was no choice. So the only choice that you had was that you had to give up your Indigenous rights.
Really? So when you were saying the plane landed, but they didn't get on, did they have to hide out or something, or?
Nope, they didn't have to hide out, because my grandfather, actually, there's a funny story in my family about actually a priest coming for the census.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was not impressed and said some choice words, and they never even stepped foot on my grandfather's land.
Good for him.
So he was like, because they're like it. Yeah. So anyway, so that's how they were raised. So my mother is the oldest female. She's the second oldest in the family. And after, in her first marriage, she did host some of her younger siblings. And I can remember my youngest uncle living with us to go to school. So they did go to school. And when you look at the totality of our family on my mother's side, although addiction has been a problem, there's been parts of it where our family struggles. The majority of us don't. Yeah. So that says a lot about being raised with your parents and learning to read and write. Like I have 2 aunts that are teachers, 2 that run successful outfitting camps. My one uncle worked for like in the bush in forestry, and then my mother, she worked she was a housekeeper for years and years. But then when when women started to be able to participate in the broader workplaces, she was hired at the mill here in town, and she loved it. Like she just loved that she could work there. So it was, so that's why I say it's a very unusual experience, because our family really was raised, like my mother was raised traditionally, really traditionally. So when I went to school, this was where we stumbled a bit, not understanding what non-Indigenous community was, because I was raised in Nakina and then a little bit in Sudbury and then here in Hornpain. So yeah, I know we're getting short on time. So it's an interesting concept, because not all Indigenous families were raised on reservations. There's urban Indigenous, and they all have different struggles. And within our groups, sometimes we have different struggles, because there's Indigenous people don't like it. It's a trust issue, right? And I'm not saying this to offend anybody, but if I look too white, I'm not trusted. So, and that's, and I have a very good supportive family, but that's out there. That's a reality within the Indigenous community that's out there. So, yeah.
And that's, like that boils down to what we were talking about before, about like just racism gets people nowhere. And I mean, that's like just the fact that people don't trust you because you look too white. That's, I guess you could say that's a form of racism, but I mean, it's infighting that you really don't need. And it doesn't bring anything to the table to stop these conflicts and anything like that.
But it also builds bridges, right? Because like I was speaking at a conference once, and my grandmother on my dad's side always had traditional meals. So I can sit at a 7-piece dinner setting, and I am totally comfortable. I'm not going to worry about that.
Yeah.
And the same thing is if I'm attending a funeral and I have to lay cedar on the casket and be in that space, I'm comfortable there. Right. So I think there's some bridges that can be had, and there's more people that have my experience that can help and build those bridges. So, but I do have to go, guys. I really enjoyed this today. This has been great.